They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but they're wrong. Revenge is a ledger that must be balanced, cent by cent, until the debt is paid in blood. My name is Elena Sterling. 3 years ago, the man my father trusted most destroyed our lives for a seat at a table that didn't belong to him. He thought he buried the Sterling name. He didn't realize he was just planting a seed. Today is graduation day at the elite St. Jude's Academy. The cameras are rolling, the world is watching, and Arthur Thorne is about to find out that when you steal a man's legacy, his ghost eventually comes back to collect. Listen closely, because this is how you dismantle an empire from the inside out.
Elena Sterling smoothed the cool, heavy silk of her emerald gown, the fabric catching the afternoon sun like a polished gemstone. To the outside world, she was just another graduate of the prestigious St. Jude's Academy, another daughter of privilege moving toward a bright future. But as she stood in the wings of the grand auditorium, she knew the truth. Today wasn't just graduation. It was the funeral of her father's legacy, and she was the one holding the shovel. 3 years ago, Marcus Sterling, a man whose name was synonymous with ethical tech leadership, had been stripped of everything. His company, Sterling Dynamics, had been his life's work, but it was dismantled in a single weekend of orchestrated betrayal. The man responsible for that ruin, Arthur Thorne, was currently sitting in the front row, wearing a suit that cost more than Elena's current apartment. He sat there with a smug, practiced humility, watching his own daughter, Sarah, prepare to receive the valedictorian award, the very award Elena had worked her entire life to earn, only to have her academic records mysteriously flagged for review the moment Arthur joined the board of trustees. The auditorium was packed with the city's elite, and the high-definition cameras for the global livestream were already active, broadcasting to millions of viewers who tuned in for the spectacle of high society achievement. Elena adjusted her mortarboard, feeling the weight of the hidden flash drive tucked into the lining of her sleeve. She wasn't carrying a traditional speech. She wasn't going to talk about bright futures or the road ahead. She was going to talk about the past. She was going to talk about the blood on the floors of the Thorne estate and the silence that followed her father's death. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and floral arrangements, but to Elena, it smelled like ozone before a storm. She took a deep breath, the emerald silk wrestling against her skin, and prepared to step into the light. The crowd fell silent as the dean approached the podium, but Elena's gaze remained fixed on Arthur Thorne. He didn't know her name. He didn't recognize the girl who had spent 3 years scrubbing floors and living in the shadows. He didn't know that the girl in the emerald gown was the daughter of the man he had murdered with a pen. But by the time she walked off that stage, he would never be able to forget her face again. This was the start of the final account.
Flashback to 3 years ago. The world had ended in a room that smelled of expensive tobacco and rain. Elena stood behind the heavy oak doors of her father's home office, her hand frozen on the brass handle. Outside, the storm was rhythmic, a relentless drumming against the window panes that mirrored the frantic beating of her heart. Through the crack in the door, she saw the silhouette of Arthur Thorne, her father's oldest friend and the chief financial officer of Sterling Dynamics. He was seated behind Marcus's mahogany desk, leaning back with a look of predatory satisfaction that Elena had never seen before. Her father, Marcus, was pacing by the window, his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of the entire building. "The accounts are empty, Marcus," Arthur had said, his voice smooth and cold, like a stone at the bottom of a well. He didn't sound worried. He sounded triumphant. Marcus turned, his face aged by a decade in a single hour. "How is that possible, Arthur? We just secured the venture capital. We had enough to cover the R&D and the employee pensions for 2 years. Arthur smiled then, a thin crocodile smile that didn't reach his eyes. Errors were made, specifically errors in the offshore filings that bear your digital signature. It was a masterpiece of betrayal. Arthur hadn't just stolen the liquidity. He'd spent 18 months meticulously framing Elena's father for the largest embezzlement scheme in the state's history. Elena watched, paralyzed, as the blue and red lights of police cruisers began to reflect against the wet pavement outside. They didn't even knock. They burst in with the confidence of men who knew their target was already beaten. Marcus Sterling, a titan of industry who had built his empire on the concept of tech for humanity, was led away in handcuffs while Arthur Thorne watched, sipping a glass of Marcus's finest scotch. Elena had fled into the shadows of the hallway, a 20-year-old girl whose entire reality had just been vaporized. 6 months later, her father died in a cold, sterile prison cell, his heart giving out before the trial could even conclude. In the eyes of the public, he died a thief. In the eyes of the financial world, his name was a curse. But Elena didn't cry at the funeral. She stood by the grave until the last mourner had left and the sun had dipped below the horizon. She touched the dirt and made a promise. She would become a ghost. She would become a shadow. And eventually she would become the storm that would tear Arthur Thorne's world apart. The mahogany desk was now Arthur's, but the debt was now Elena's to collect.
For 3 years, Elena Sterling ceased to exist. She became Sarah's best friend, a quiet, studious girl named Elena Vance, who seemed to have no family and no past. She bleached her dark hair into a stark platinum blonde and wore glasses she didn't need, effectively erasing the Sterling features from her face. She worked 3 grueling jobs, waitressing at a dive bar, tutoring underclassmen, and even cleaning the very offices she once hoped to lead, all to pay for a degree at the same elite university where Arthur Thorne's daughter, Sarah, was the star student. Elena knew that to destroy a man like Arthur, you couldn't attack him from the outside. You had to become a virus inside his own home. She befriended Sarah Thorne with a calculated precision that would have terrified her father. Sarah was a girl made of silk and ignorance, sheltered by a father who treated her like his most precious asset. To Sarah, Elena was a confidant, the person she whispered her deepest secrets to over late-night study sessions, fueled by espresso and privilege. And every secret was a data point. Elena learned about the second ledger Arthur kept in a hidden safe behind a painting in his study, a vault he only opened when he thought he was alone. She learned about the weekend trips to Macau, where millions in consulting fees were laundered through high-stakes baccarat tables. She learned about the specific dummy corporations, Thorne Global, Zenith Holdings, Argentum Partners, that were actually empty shells designed to siphon funds from Sterling Dynamics' remaining assets. Elena lived in a state of constant low-level adrenaline, her mind always moving 3 steps ahead. She attended every party at the Thorne mansion, acting the part of the grateful, lower-middle-class friend, while secretly mapping the security cameras and memorizing the keypad codes. She watched as Arthur Thorne grew more arrogant, his wealth expanding as he cannibalized the ruins of her father's dream. He was a man who believed he was untouchable, a man who thought that because he had destroyed the king, he was entitled to the throne. But Elena was building a file that grew heavier with every passing month. She had photos of the ledger, recordings of phone calls, and digital trails that Arthur thought he had scrubbed from the internet. She was no longer just a daughter looking for revenge. She was a ghost in the machine, waiting for the perfect moment to manifest. The ghost protocol wasn't just about hiding. It was about the slow, agonizing process of preparing the evidence that would ensure Arthur Thorne didn't just lose his money, but his soul. The opportunity Elena had been waiting for arrived under the guise of an act of friendship. Sarah Thorne was heading to the Swiss Alps for a week of skiing and asked Elena to house-sit at the mansion. It was the ultimate irony, the fox being invited into the coop. The flash drive Elena now held at her graduation was born in those 7 days of silence. The mansion was a tomb of expensive marble and hollow echoes, but Elena moved through it with the purpose of a professional saboteur. She didn't head for the jewelry or the art. She headed for the mahogany desk, the same desk that had once sat in her father's office. Using a sophisticated keylogger she'd spent months learning to program, she bypassed Arthur's biometric security in less than an hour. But the real treasure wasn't in the digital files. It was in the room itself. Elena had installed a micro-sized, high-fidelity recording device inside the base of a decorative lamp on the desk. She hadn't expected much, but she caught the jackpot. On the final night of her stay, Arthur had returned home early, drunk on ego and expensive bourbon. He had a visitor, a former board member of Sterling Dynamics who was getting nervous about the SEC's renewed interest in white-collar crime. Elena, hiding in the dark library adjacent to the study, listened through the hidden mic as Arthur's voice boomed through the speakers on her receiver. Marcus was too soft, Arthur laughed, the sound chillingly familiar. He thought loyalty meant something in this business. He thought the men he hired were his family. In this world, loyalty is just a debt waiting to be collected, and Marcus was behind on his payments. He went on to describe in agonizing detail the moment he saw the light leave Marcus's eyes when the handcuffs were clicked shut. He bragged about how easy it was to manipulate the digital signatures and how he had personally ensured Marcus wouldn't survive his first year in custody. The man was a relic, Arthur concluded, and relics belong in the ground. Elena had sat in the dark, her nails digging into her palms until she drew blood. Every word was a knife, but it was also a gift. She had his confession. She had the names of the co-conspirators. She had the roadmap to the stolen millions. As she packed her bags the next morning, she felt a strange sense of calm. The weight of the flash drive in her pocket was the only thing that felt real. Arthur Thorne thought he was the ultimate collector, but he had forgotten one fundamental rule of the universe. Debt always comes due, and the interest on a stolen life is more than he could ever hope to pay. The moment Elena stepped onto the stage, the air in the auditorium seemed to freeze. She looked down at the sea of faces, the wealthy, the powerful, and the blissfully unaware. She saw Arthur Thorne leaning forward, a patronizing smile on his face, expecting a standard valedictory speech about the bright future of the class. Elena tapped the microphone. The sharp, piercing screech of feedback echoed through the hall, making the audience wince. Sarah Thorne is a brilliant student, Elena began, her voice steady, resonating with a cold clarity that cut through the murmurs. She is a talented athlete, a gifted pianist, and a loyal friend. But above all else, she is the daughter of a thief. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Behind her, the massive projector screen, usually reserved for the school's crest, flickered and died for a second before blooming into a vibrant, terrifying red. Not with graduation photos, but with bank statements. Names of dummy corporations, Zenith, Argentum, Sterling Ruin, flashed in bold letters. Figures with 8 zeros scrolled by like a slot machine. Arthur Thorne stood up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Turn it off," he roared, his voice cracking. "Security, get her off that stage." But the technicians in the booth, grad students Elena had paid 3 years of savings to recruit, didn't move. They had locked the system. Elena didn't flinch. She pressed a button on her remote, and Arthur's own voice filled the auditorium. Marcus was too soft. He thought loyalty meant something. The recording was crystal clear, the sound of Arthur's drunken laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The audience sat in a horrified trance, watching the public execution of a man's reputation. Sarah Thorne sat in her chair, her face as white as her graduation gown, her eyes fixed on the friend she thought she knew. Elena looked directly into the lens of the primary livestream camera. "This isn't just about my father," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "This is about the thousands of employees whose pensions you stole to buy this mansion. This is about the name Sterling, which you dragged through the dirt while you built your throne on his grave. My name is Elena Sterling, and the accounts are finally balanced." The screen changed one last time, showing a live tracking map of the SEC's official website, where a press release was currently being uploaded with Arthur Thorne's name at the very top. The valedictorian was no longer a student. She was the executioner. The aftermath was a whirlwind of choreographed chaos. The live stream had peaked at over 1 million viewers as the clip of Arthur's confession went viral within minutes. By the time Elena walked off the stage, the heavy oak doors of the auditorium were pushed open, not by latecomers, but by federal agents and windbreakers. The SEC, tipped off by an anonymous data dump Elena had sent hours earlier, didn't wait for a formal summons. Arthur Thorne tried to reach the side exit, his breathing ragged, but the path was blocked by a wall of flashbulbs and reporters. The press, tipped off by the same source, was hungry for the fall of a titan. Within the hour, every asset linked to Thorne Global and its shell companies was frozen. The mahogany desk was tagged as evidence. The mansion in the hills was cordoned off. Elena stood on the steps of the academy, watching as the man who had destroyed her father was read his rights in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. Sarah Thorne approached her, her eyes red-rimmed, her graduation cap forgotten on the ground. "Why, Elena?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I loved you like a sister. I trusted you." Elena looked at her, and for a fleeting second, she felt a pang of guilt, but it was buried under 3 years of cold, hard earth. "I didn't choose to be your friend because I hated you, Sarah," Elena said, her voice devoid of emotion. "I chose you because you were the only way to get close to the man who killed my father. He didn't just take a company, He took a life, a reputation, and my future. He left my father to die in a cage for a crime he committed. Elena leaned in closer, her emerald gown shimmering in the harsh light of the police sirens. Now, your father can spend the rest of his life in a room the size of the one he left my father in. That's not revenge, Sarah. That's math. Elena didn't stay to watch the final arrest. She walked away from the academy, stripping off the emerald gown to reveal the simple black dress she wore underneath. She was no longer a ghost, and she was no longer a Sterling. She was simply free. The weight she had carried for 3 years was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet vacuum. The storm had passed, and in its wake, only the truth remained standing. Arthur Thorne was no longer a man. He was a case file, and Elena was finally stepping out of the shadows.
6 months had passed since the night the world watched Arthur Thorne fall. Elena stood on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue, her coat collar turned up against the biting autumn wind. She looked up at the towering glass skyscraper that had once been the headquarters of Thorne Global. Today, the workmen were high up on scaffolds, carefully removing the heavy brass letters of the Thorne name. In their place, they were hoisting a new sign, the Sterling Foundation for Corporate Integrity. Elena hadn't wanted the money. After the liquidation of Arthur's assets and the recovery of the stolen millions, she had the legal right to a fortune, but she had signed it all over to a trust. The foundation was her real goal, a place dedicated to investigating white-collar crime and protecting the families of those destroyed by men like Arthur. The name Sterling was no longer a curse in the financial journals. It was a beacon. As she watched the crane lock the final G of Sterling into place, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from an unknown number, likely one of the few journalists she still kept in contact with. Arthur Thorne was sentenced to 25 years today. No possibility of parole for the first 15. Sarah has relocated to Europe under a new name. Elena read the message twice, then hit delete. She didn't feel the surge of joy she had once expected. There was no celebration, no champagne, no sense of triumph. There was only the quiet, cold satisfaction of a job completed. Karma, she realized, wasn't a sudden bolt of lightning or a dramatic twist of fate. It was a slow, methodical process. It was the result of 1,000 small choices, the inevitable conclusion of a life built on lies. She turned away from the building and began to walk toward the park, blending into the crowd of commuters. To them, she was just another woman in a black coat, another face in the city. She liked it that way. Her father's name was back on the glass. His owner had been restored, and the debt had been paid in full. As the sun set behind the skyline, casting long golden shadows across the pavement, Elena Sterling finally stopped looking back. The account was settled. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the city and the faint rhythmic ticking of the clock, the sound of time moving forward, finally unburdened by the past.